Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Really grateful to our first panel and really excited to hear from our second panel. We're going to continue our discussion today, looking at one of the most important issues impacting U.S. and world trade, the disruption of global supply chains caused by COVID, especially. We got into it a little bit in the first panel, but this is really where we're going to do a much deeper dive. Before I introduce our panel, and want to ask them to please turn on their cameras. Before I introduce them, though, we'd like to welcome and call out a couple more of the guests who are here with us today in our audience. Not on camera, Rory Heslington with Autos Drive America, Chris Denzel with DHL Express, Sarah Dean with John Deere, and Virginia Gum with the Aluminum Association. Welcome, Rory, Chris, Sarah, and Virginia. And welcome to our panel. Trade doesn't often make the front page of America's newspapers, but disruptions in the global supply chains have caught everyone's attention. I'm delighted to welcome today's panel to unpack some of the critical issues impacting global supply chains and hopefully give us some ideas about ways to solve some of those disruptions. So welcome, first of all, back to the WITC stage to John Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation. Welcome back as well to Phil Levy, Chief Economist at Flexport and formerly a Senior Economist for Trade for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome to Penny Naas, President of International Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS and one of our leadership sponsors for our conference. Thank you so much for all your support, Penny. Maria Zieba, Assistant Vice President of International Affairs at the National Pork Producers Council, also another supporter of this conference. Thank you so much, Maria and the pork producers. And our moderator, Anna Swanson, a correspondent for the New York Times, who has written about many aspects of supply chain disruptions over the past few months. We're delighted to have you all here today. Anna?
Thank you so much, Ken. These WITC events are always a little like homecoming for trade people. So really delighted to be back here. And I hope next year, maybe we can gather in person. So I've always been fascinated by supply chain issues, but I think for a lot of people, there's been a new appreciation with the pandemic that when you click on something on Amazon, it doesn't just show up on your doorstep the next day by magic. There's this whole complicated global machinery that whirs into life to deliver that good exactly when and where you want it. And some people would argue that this system has continued operating very smoothly, given the challenges that the world is facing right now. But obviously, there are also major signs of stress beyond just your shortages of cream cheese and Pelotons. Supply chain challenges are one of the biggest factors right now that are holding back economic growth and pushing inflation to a 40-year high. So that's a major challenge for businesses and policymakers alike. I'd like to get into some of these topics with this fantastic panel. Let me start with some of the issues, what the issues in the supply chain look like right now. And then a little later, we'll turn to some potential solutions. We definitely want to get into audience questions as well. So please put those in the Q&A tab of the Zoom. Let me start with you, Phil. When we say supply chain disruptions, what are we talking about? How are you measuring supply chain disruptions at Flexport? And what are some of the root causes?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Ken. I think the problem has been maybe not enough whirring and too much sputtering, as you put it. I think one of the lessons that we've had from the pandemic is how you really have a supply chain and each link can be subject to difficulties. And we saw that from early on, where it was at the very beginning in the spring of 2020, could you get workers to factories? Were things being supplied? Then could you transport goods from the factories to the ports? Were there planes available or ships to move things from port to port, and then warehousing, trucking, all of these? We've had interruptions that have come because it's hard to get workers. And sometimes that's induced by either the pandemic directly or indirectly. We've had port closures, we've had ships stuck. How does that all, which then begs the question, okay, fine, those are a lot of impediments. What does it all add up to, and how well is the system functioning? I think there's a couple of measures one can look at. The one that's gotten a lot of attention initially was prices, that it just became very expensive. Things where people had assumed that you could move goods relatively cheaply, maybe pay $1,500 to move a container across the Pacific. You were seeing $15,000 So a 10x move in prices, that's certainly one indication of the challenge. The thing that we've put out at Flexport to try and give a direct measure is also a measure of time, which is how long does it take to get from cargo ready at the factory, when it's ready to leave the factory, to when is it picked up from its destination port. And what we have seen is that there has been a very marked increase in the amount of time. And that's actually not just a US thing. We measure it to North America and we measure it to Europe. And in each case, you've seen a dramatic increase. Just to quantify, pre-pandemic, this particular measure would be 40 to 50 days going across the Pacific from Asia to North America. The latest number that we just put out yesterday was 110 days. So, which clearly has an effect, as you say, somebody places an order and wants something to come, how full is the warehouse and how stocked are the shelves? So.
Right. Yeah, that's a great introduction. Penny, I want to go to you next because you have a really unique lens into the situation on the ground. So what is the situation that you're seeing at ports, and then how would you contrast that with capacity for rail and for trucking?
Anna, thanks so much. And Phil, thank you for kind of starting to set the scene for us. I think I'd like to just start with a fact, which is that no US port is in the top 50 globally in terms of productivity. So when you look at the US port system, and not every port is the same, but in general, we can see that the US port infrastructure maybe has not kept up with some of the other global trends that we see out there. So I think our port infrastructure is something that we do need to invest in. And by investing in, it doesn't just mean the hard infrastructure, but also some of the things around digitalization that are now entering into the international trade world. So I think our ports and complement that with infrastructure that needs to be provided in terms of roads and bridges and also airports. That's I think a very important thing that we all need to focus on. And I know Sarah mentioned it on the previous panel as well. So I'd like to start with infrastructure, followed by transparency and digitalization. Again, this is something we need to invest in, but what we're seeing around the world is a lot more digitalization being injected into logistics. And again, that is not something that we've always kept up with in the United States. So that's another point I think that we just need to keep an eye on. And then last is the people. And I think Phil referenced it with regards to workers, but we've just been in a very complex environment with regards to labor. And again, supply chains are really driven by people. And I think that we need to think about how you combine some of the issues around people with how we move supply chains around the world if we want to tackle some of these issues. So Anna, I think I'll leave it there to start, but and I appreciate the conversation today.
Great, yeah. John, turning to you, how are these disruptions impacting importers? For retailers, the supply chain challenges have often resulted from surging consumer demand, but there are a lot of challenges as well, right?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Thanks, Ken, for the invitation to participate today. And just to tie into what Phil and Penny were talking about, I mean, in general, the challenge right now is that the consumer demand is far outpacing the available supply of everything that's needed to not only just make, but move both finished goods as well as inputs to production. This has led to massive supply chain disruptions that have been going on throughout the pandemic. To be honest, many of the challenges we're facing today actually existed before the pandemic, but they've been further exacerbated because of the challenges that we're seeing. Port congestion, chassis availability, the situation with empty containers. Those were all things we've been working on previously that just hadn't gotten the attention that they're getting today. It continues to be a challenge, and those are key areas we need to continue to focus on. For retailers, the end result has been that the retailers have looked for ways to mitigate the impact of the disruptions and have always been looking to do that. They really engaged before the holiday shipping season to make sure that there were products on the store shelves for Christmas. But even earlier on in the pandemic, trying to adjust for some of those goods that were really hot that folks were looking for. So some of the strategies that retailers sought to employ was shipping early, looking at alternate ports, not just relying on LA Long Beach, but looking at East Coast and Gulf Coast as well, looking for alternate modes of transportation. So air freight certainly picked up throughout the pandemic as well. and looking at alternate sourcing. But that certainly has some challenges with it, whether it's onshore, near shore, or just looking to other places within Asia. Retailers continue to make significant investments in their supply chains and overall operations to make sure they're meeting consumer needs. We kind of joked early on that we saw 5 years worth of innovation within the first 5 months of the pandemic, as many retailers were forced to shut down and rely on e-commerce that many hadn't had really fully developed e-commerce plans yet. So you saw the advent of things like buy online, pick up in store, curbside pickup that really hadn't been on the plan for many retailers until a couple of years down the road. But those, have taken off and continue to be a good service that retailers offer today. But, in general, across the board, retailers have saw delays throughout their supply chain at every step along the way. They've seen cost increases at every step along the way, and they're continuing to plan for that now, not just looking at what's happening today, but trying to plan for the future and build more resiliency into their supply chains.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's been a lot of transformation in the industry. And I do want to talk about reshoring, nearshoring. But first, Maria, a lot of the focus has been on imports. Tell me about the kinds of bottlenecks that we're seeing for US exports.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And thanks, WITA, for inviting me to discuss these supply chain issues, and the other panelists, Phil and Penny and John, for setting the stage. So for US agriculture, we've faced a lot of ups and downs over the past few years. And it's been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, like John mentioned. For us specifically, for US ag and for pork exports, we've certainly faced a lot of issues exporting our products. Phil mentioned this, container prices are on average 170% higher than a year ago. But we're still continuing to face that last minute cancellation of shipments, as the previous panel talked about. This really does create that bottleneck as we get set to export a product and a carrier decides to go back to Asia and not carry agricultural goods. That leads to a bottleneck beyond just the product, the perishable product sitting at a port. But also we're seeing that cold storage facilities at ports are already at capacity. It's going beyond the ports, but also we're dealing with chassis availability. And then when shipments get canceled, we have the detention and demurrage charges, and then trying to figure out how are we going to get this product into cold storage and to find the available labor of the truckers to move product around. So it's certainly been an issue for us that we've had to deal with for over a year now. And the other part of this is there are some countries like China who also have a zero tolerance policy for COVID. So if they have a couple of COVID outbreaks from workers at a terminal, that terminal shuts down. So now there's a bottleneck waiting for our ad products to be offloaded in that country, the receiving country. So it's certainly been a large effects. And then I'd say that I would be remiss in not adding that on top of all these issues at the ports, we're still facing the trade retaliation of a 25% retaliatory duty into China. So while the rest of the world on pork, at least, is paying a 12% duty, we're having to pay a 37% duty into China, which is not making us very competitive. And as Secretary Vilsack said yesterday during his announcement, the U.S. is really looking at losing market access into some of these key markets, and it's making us less competitive, and somebody has to eat the cost of all these additional fees and these bottlenecks. And unfortunately, we're seeing that at retail.
And so I understand that supply chain bottlenecks are also creating an issue for farmers in terms of rising input prices. How are farmers and ranchers dealing with issues like inflation, worker shortages, some of the other economic constraints that they're looking at right now?
Yeah, so, we talk a lot about exports, but we're not talking too much about the imports and the supply chain disruptions on our imports. Key nutrients that are added to the feeds, vitamins, minerals, that sort of thing. Some of these are 4 times higher than a year ago. And we're even facing disruptions in plastics and plastic ear tags for our hogs, so we could differentiate them. And in the fall, we saw some disruptions in plastic packaging. So these are all the things that are adding to the price that you're seeing at the grocery store. I'd also like to, it's really important that when we talk about the inputs going up, that we're also have to talk about the issue that we're having on labor, which is we are really, really struggling to find labor, and we don't have a visa program for non-degree holding ag workers, and that are for year round to work on hog farms and packing plants. So there's a couple of things that have been done. USDA has recently announced a $1 billion loan program, a guarantee loan program for grants as well to extend packing capacity in the United States. And that's really positive as long as the proper balance is struck with these plans. But it's the issue is always going to come back to, are we going to have the labor to work at these hog farms and packing plants? So I'd say that producers are facing a lot of volatility from the retaliatory tariffs still in effect, the increases in inputs because of the supply chain disruptions, and then on top of that, you have to add on the labor scarcity.
John, I'm sure labor is a major issue for your members as well. You mentioned that you had done a survey of your members. What are they expecting for trends for 2022?
Yeah, we've done a couple of different benchmarking surveys with our members to look at the ongoing issues and see how they're being impacted. I wish I had good news coming out of this survey as far as what's going to happen in 2022. But I think many who responded to the survey expect more of the same in 2022. Many don't expect the disruptions to subside until later on in 2022, maybe Q4. And that's because there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's happening in the supply chain, a lot of uncertainty over the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. We just went through the Omicron surge, and it's what's next? What's the next variant that's going to impact and have an impact? We talked about, the China having the zero tolerance for COVID. The little shutdown they have has an impact, and it ripples throughout the supply chain. I think the good news there, though, is unfortunately, or fortunately, China is much better at getting things back up and running in their ports than we are. And part of that is because of the technology, automation, digitization they have at their ports, which is something that we need to, continue to push and to talk about. But with regards to, what our members think are going to be continuing in 2022, the top three issues they cite are U.S. port congestion, workforce shortages, again, throughout the supply chain, and then ocean carrier capacity. Again, we're looking at imports to continue to increase in 2022, not at the double-digit rate we saw in 2021, but we're looking at single-digit increases for this year. The Global Port Tracker that we just put out, again, calls for single-digit, but you've got to take a look back at what happened in 2020 and 2021 because of that strong consumer demand. You saw an uptick in 2020 in imports, put us up at about 22 million TEUs, which was a record of imports coming into the US. And then last year, we saw that rise up to 26 million TEUs, which are just unheard of numbers coming through our ports. And, despite those record numbers, I give credit to Longshoremen and others working at the ports being able to put through the throughput. We still have challenges, but they're the folks on the front line, and applaud them for all the work they're doing. But again, folks still see high inventory levels, which is going to be a challenge, especially with lack of available warehouse space. And then again, looking at transportation costs across the board, increasing or being higher again in 2022. But retailers are continuing to plan ahead. And one other disruption issue that we're looking at that folks are already starting to plan for now is the fact that we have a labor contract negotiation set for July with the West Coast labor negotiations. The contract is set to expire in July, and folks are already starting to plan now because there's a history of disruption tied around those events. We certainly hope the parties will get to the table early and negotiate and not engage in any kind of disruption issues. But folks aren't taking any chances, and they're going to plan accordingly to make sure they don't get caught if there are any kind of further disruptions on the West Coast.
Yeah, that will be really important follow, because in the past we have seen, work slowdowns and an impact on supply chains from that, and it comes at a really fragile time for the supply chain, right? So we'll be watching that closely.
Well, and just to add, it does come at a fragile time because, again, this gets back to the time of the peak shipping season for retailers as retailers start to bring in their holiday merchandise. So that's going to further potentially impact the port fluidity.
Mm-hmm. Are you already seeing folks look at other ports on the other coast?
Yeah, I mean, that diversification has been ongoing throughout the pandemic, and this is just going to further push folks to look at that diversification.
Really interesting. Yeah. Penny, I wanted to ask you how you're seeing customers structure and plan their supply chains around some of these events. And how are companies managing their inventory for whatever they think is coming this year?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think there's a debate around just in time versus just in case. And whether we have seen an increase in inventories and people increasing their inventories. Part of the GDP increase was attributed to people rebuilding and or building anew certain inventories of goods. What we're seeing on that front as well is I think two things in particular I'd like to focus on. First is transparency around your supply chain. I think all of us have discovered that it's kind of a basic risk principle, but that you really need to know where all the components in your supply chain are coming from. And for a variety of reasons, whether it's some of the new rules around prohibitions on forced labor from certain regions of China, to issues around certain cities shutting down due to COVID. So, Vietnam shut down and that for a certain period, and that then had follow-on effects for a lot of companies that may not have realized that they had certain components that were being made in Vietnam that were going to shut things down. So I think overall what we're seeing is our customers putting a renewed focus on really digging in and trying to understand their full supply chain to a level that maybe they haven't in the past, including down to kind of where the factory is, where things are. Then once they're getting that transparency, I think what we're seeing is something that was already there before the pandemic, which was a move towards more intra-regional trade. So pre-pandemic, we were already moving in that direction. And I think that as we move into the post-pandemic era, again, I think without the ability to travel, shifting supply chains at times can be a challenge because you really do need to, again, go back to that transparency, see your factories, make sure that the practices they're following are the things that you as a purchaser or an end manufacturer want to see. But I think that that's another really important piece is that as we come out of this and travel resumes, I think we're really anticipating, I don't want to call it nearshoring, but a continued move towards that regionalization of supply chains. And lastly, I think trade policy is also going in that direction with, kind of multilateralism not moving very quickly at the moment. We are seeing a lot of activity with regional trade agreements. And I think that that's also creating some of the incentives, whether it be RCEP and some of the innovations that come in the RCEP agreement. It's really pushing, I think, people to look again for regional suppliers that maybe come with, what they believe will be slightly less complex logistics of getting goods from one place to the other.
Okay, great. And I do want to get more into those supply chain shifts. But first, I wanted to ask Phil, these supply chain challenges have been a lot longer lasting than some people have anticipated. But what do you see now as the scenarios whereby this would clear, and how would we know if it is getting better?
Yeah, good question. And it gets back to something I might have neglected what you asked me earlier, which is what is the root cause? But John addressed it well, that you have a situation where demand is exceeding the capacity to supply things. That could come from one of two possibilities. It could be that you're having regular demand and the supply chain is just breaking down, or it could be that you're having unusually large levels of demand and the supply chain just isn't able to keep up. And I think John also gave us the statistics as to why we probably think it's the latter. because when you're seeing record levels of imports and you're seeing, consumer goods consumption hit extraordinary levels, this is suggesting a system that's sort of overwhelmed by demand. I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is not uncommon when you have a system that requires lots of investment up front, that you build it to handle a certain peak capacity, not to have lots and lots and lots of excess capacity. So here we get a surge that has taken us beyond peak capacity for a really prolonged period, where the norm is that you just hit that, as John talked about, when you have retailers stocking up for the holidays, that there's a tough time of year. The whole year has been that way. The upshot has been that not only have we had sort of current congestion, but we have backlogs, that we have a lot of containers waiting to be moved. So how does this clear? How do we get out of this? What's the scenario? I don't think we do it without a decrease in demand for goods, which can come through an overall decrease in what people are spending, or it can come through a shift back from how much they're spending on goods relative to services. Traditionally, we're nearly a 70% services economy. That pulled back during the pandemic, and there was a shift towards goods, and that's where a lot of this strain is coming from. So I think you get a decrease in demand at some point, and then it has to occur at the right point. So if you got that decrease in demand right on the eve of peak season, that doesn't really give you that extra capacity to clear a backlog. And so it has to come at the right point in the year where, here's some breathing space, we clear the backlog. How will we know that this has happened? Well, that's why we did things like Flexport's ocean timeliness indicator, is we're just tracking how long does it take to get from cargo ready to destination port pickup. We know what the sort of normal times were pre-pandemic. If we return to those, so instead of 110 days, we're talking about 45, that'll be a sign that we've managed to set things right, I think.
Great. And Phil, we did have one audience question from Marley at International Trade Today that might be a good fit for you. And if others want to jump in here, please feel free. But she asked, how much of an effect have anti-dumping and Section 301 tariffs on chassis had on straining the supply chain? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We've already had mention of there being a shortage. I think Maria was talking about the difficulty of finding chassis. That's very real. I don't think it helps in any way to sort of put tariffs on goods that are in short supply. That's sort of just doing harm to ourselves. I can't quantify exactly how much that's done, but yeah, it's a real concern. And so I think you can see this in two directions. You've got serious congestion, which means that a lot of chassis are being taken up holding things. What are your options at that point? You could try to clear the congestion and make things flow better. One certainly ought to do that. But if it were possible at low cost to bring in more chassis, that would help. And it's unfortunate when the government makes that more expensive.
And if I can jump in here too, I mean, everything when I talk to truckers and ports and everybody else, they all talk about this being a significant impact, and those tariffs coming in at the worst time possible, impacting the supply chain, because as we know, there is currently a chassis shortage, and part of this is just the lack of number of chassis available, but the fact that many chassis are sitting under empty containers that are just either sitting at the port, sitting outside the port, taking up valuable space. And the fact that you have a 221%, AD/CVD tariff on top of these chassis, nobody's bringing in chassis anymore. And the domestic providers aren't going to be able to meet the demand, from what I heard, until 2024. So we're going to go another year having a chassis shortage because of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, this gets to a question I wanted to pose to all of you, which is that we've seen the Biden administration try to take various steps to address supply chain bottlenecks and inflation. Are there any of these efforts that you would point to as more or less successful? Anything that you think is particularly needed? How much government influence does the government actually wield when it comes to dealing with supply chain issues? Whoever would like to, anyone want to jump in on that big question?
I'm happy to start. Look, we appreciate the attention the administration is paying to supply chains now. We think it was a positive step to name John Picari as the White House ports envoy to try and address some of the challenges. But the challenges are immense, and there's a lot that needs to be done. There's no single silver bullet that's going to fix everything. I think, as we've already talked about, it's like every step along the way, there's a challenge we have to get worked out. I think what the administration needs to continue to do is basically use the bully pulpit and get the right stakeholders in a room and trying to address some of these challenges, again, that existed well before the pandemic. I think focusing on things like digitization that Penny was talking about, that I think we're going to talk a little bit about later too, is critical. And, we've got to figure out a better way going forwards, because I think, as Penny addressed too, we can't build our way out of this challenge physically. Our ports are kind of at their max right now. We've got to figure out how do we make ourselves more productive, more efficient, more resilient. And part of that is by using better data, better and more timely data, but also looking at some of the key agencies that have enforcement abilities to address some of these challenges, like the Federal Maritime Commission, and addressing some of the challenges with detention demurrage, which have skyrocketed and have led to increased costs throughout the pandemic. Look, we fully support detention demurrage as a mechanism to move containers quickly or return equipment quickly, but you can't do that when you've got a fully congested port. But yet you've got these charges being laid on many shippers and truckers for issues that are beyond their control. And so I think those are issues we need to take a look at. So again, looking at things like passing the Ocean Shipping Reform Act in 2021, another thing that we think needs to happen that the administration fully supports. The House passed it overwhelmingly. Now we need the Senate to act. We think these are some common sense reforms that are going to help address some of the business practices that have developed over the past couple of years. It's not going to be that panacea fixing everything now, but we'll address some of these behaviors that need to be changed looking now and in the future.
Anyone else want to jump in there? I was just thinking about, because thinking about the containers that are stuck on chassis, the administration has started kind of a variety of pop-up container yards and, threats of fines for long-dwelling containers. Do you think any of that has actually moved the needle? Or are we really talking about longer-term, bigger investments in port infrastructure, digitization, as you're saying, to make a difference?
I think on the dwell fees, the fees that have been proposed for LA and Long Beach, those have been threatened to be put on the carriers, who then turned around and threatened to put them on the importers. I think so. Again, looking at passing the buck. I think many of the larger retailers have been working to move their containers, those that have been sitting for a while. But look, they've got long free time because of the contracts they've negotiated with the carriers. So trying to work through some of those challenges and issues. You've got individual terminals that are now looking to put their own excessive dwell fees in place that are very different than what the ports have put in place. And, from what I've seen from a few emails that have come across, again, they're being applied unfairly and not giving importers enough time to be able to go in and get those containers when they want to get them. There's now a threat of putting new fees on long dwelling empty containers. There's been so much focus on getting the loaded containers out of the terminal that we have not paid enough attention to the hundreds of thousands of empty containers that are just sitting idle, again, either at the terminals or sitting out in somebody's yard. I know Maria's members and other ag folks would love to have those empty containers to get them back over to Asia, or just evacuate those containers because there's a container shortage in Asia as well. So we've got to figure out, how do we balance, all these issues? And I think we've got to put more attention on those empties, again, that create problems not only just overseas, but take up valuable space in the yard and don't allow for the longshoremen to do better planning in the yard and move the containers around and be able to get that throughput that we need.
Yeah,
Maria, did you have it? Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I agree with a lot what John was saying. And I think the one thing that we certainly need to see is the Senate take up the OSRA, Ocean Shipping Reform Act. The provisions that are ag specific, that Representatives Georg Mendy and Dusty Johnson wrote in the House bill, it passed overwhelmingly and are going to do a lot of good for our industry. And we would love to see the Senate take up a very similar version to that. But yesterday, aside from that, you had asked previously about what the administration is doing, and USDA did announce yesterday a joint ventureship with the Port of Oakland. They're going to be setting up a 25-acre site to allow U.S. companies to fill those empty shipping containers with U.S. products. We think that a lot of that is going to go towards ag. And then, of course, USDA is fronting a lot of the startup costs, the 60% of startup costs, and additional $125 per container. So that's really good news, especially for my guys who are exporting fresh pork to Japan. Oakland is actually one of the big terminals where we're exporting that high value fresh pork to Japan. And what we've seen over the last few years, and especially last year, is that a lot of the carriers decided to just bypass Oakland to avoid the delays that they were facing. And that really put in jeopardy that Japanese access that, as we all know, we fought really hard under TPP, then we finally got under that Japan-US phase 1. But all of that is at risk if we can't get our pork out into containers and out through Oakland. So the announcement yesterday by the secretary is really good news for us, and hopefully we can start seeing more containers being cleared and the process moving forward a lot quicker and getting better efficiencies, like John was saying.
And Maria, I was curious, what did you think about the Biden administration's efforts to increase competition in meat processing?
Well, for our industry, we certainly love to hear about more packing capacity. It's always really good for our industry. But I'd say that first, we talked a lot about food price inflation. There's a paper that was just recently published by Iowa State and North Carolina State and MPPC that tracked food price inflation. And we found that, or the paper found that, the Economist found that pork prices have been rising because of, one, strong demand for US pork, but also the higher input costs and labor shortages. And so we certainly would need to see some of those issues addressed. I think that when it comes to concentration in the meat packing industry, over the past 5 years, we've actually seen that our pork producers have been building new packing plants. And it's quite interesting that we've seen this, and what led to building of new packing plants and deconcentration is actually years ago, when the United States was in the middle of negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, our producers saw that there was going to be tremendous potential for exports to Southeast Asia. So a few of them decided to open their own packing plants, and that's how we've seen and invest in that. And over the last few years, we've seen 5 new packing plants come online, most of which are producer owned. And this has really created a pretty good opportunity for us. So it's certainly something that we want to work with the Biden administration on more packing capacity, as I mentioned earlier. But just a figure I do want to throw out there is that according to the Department of Justice, they have a index that they look at concentration, and they measure concentration for specific sectors. And any sort of score that is 1,500 and below means that it's not concentrated. And pork packing plants actually fall on a score of 1,300 or so, 1,350. So it's certainly, we want to work with the Biden administration, but we are in a position where we're not seeing as much of that concentration, at least on the pork packing side of things.
I did want to remind the audience to go ahead and submit questions in the Q&A tab. We have another audience question from Daniel Pearson. To what extent do inefficiencies at U.S. container ports relate to opposition from organized labor to the adoption of more advanced technologies? Does the country need to consider further policy changes at ports? I think is a good question here. Maybe Penny or Phil, any thoughts on potential policy changes in the situation at ports? Or automation as well. It seems like this question is getting to trends to automation at ports as well.
Bill, do you want to go first? Or
Sure, I'm happy to. I think what we can say is that, as was cited earlier, the U.S. ports are not the most efficient in the world. That means there's room for improvement, and I think one can examine a whole series of things that would make those ports more efficient, and it's important that we do. I don't think that the discussion earlier captured it well. I don't think that's a short-term solution to the problem, but I think it is a worthwhile goal. I think some of the measures the Biden administration has put forward are constructive. Investment in infrastructure is constructive. One can look and see about sort of the way things are processed. I don't know that we have an immediate fix or want to micromanage the operation of ports, but there's clearly improvement that can be made.
Mhm. And Penny, you had kind of touched on this earlier, but maybe you could talk a bit about the trends that you're seeing in terms of automation as well as reshoring.
Yeah, so maybe just to follow up a little bit on Phil and John's point. So going all the way kind of back to what can the Biden administration do? I think one of the most important things they can do is they've got the convening power, because this involves localities, states, federal, and international. So if you really want to address some of these issues, you've got to look at it in all these different ways, and bringing all the parties together to talk about it is the only way you're really gonna address this. Now, with regards to longshoremen and labor, I mean, the one thing I think we have seen in the past few months is that there's a war for talent, and that there are, you know, we are a very large Teamster company, proudly Teamster company at UPS, and having a strong labor contract has provided some stability in terms of wages during the past year for us as a company. It's also because of the conditions that we have and other things, we've had lower turnover at UPS. So I would just say that when we look at some of these labor issues, there's also, I think, going to Phil's point, there's clearly some inefficiencies that we need to be looking at in these ports. But I would just throw out that we've got to look at this holistically with local, state, federal, and some international to make sure that we're putting together the most efficient ports possible. I was going to cite one very specific example that we're involved with at the Port of LA and Long Beach called Accelerate Cargo. And through this program, we're providing advanced data on behalf of all of our customers and sending that into the port to help with managing some of the cargo containers. And with it, we're supposed to see an increase of 20% greater efficiency with regards to the ability to move containers through the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach. So this is an ongoing program, one that we're working with them on today. But looking at some of these issues around tweaks of providing data in advance and allowing people to do more advanced planning, you know, some of that's low-hanging fruit in terms of driving greater efficiency by pushing out some of these things, using data, pulling parties together to share data that they maybe in the past haven't, to create greater productivity in some of these ports.
Those are great points. Yeah, thank you so much. We did have another audience question here from Adam Barbina. Thanks for your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the impact of human rights laws on supply chains and where we are headed in the next few years? Would love some general thoughts, but John, I definitely wanted to ask you about the specific changes that companies are making ahead of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which goes into effect in June and will apply a rebuttable presumption for goods made with in whole or in part from Xinjiang. So this is a major deal for retailers as well, right? How are companies responding in terms of looking at their supply chains ahead of that policy?
Thanks, Anne. I mean, it's a major deal for any company who's sourcing out of China, because it doesn't just impact in retail. It's, you know, any company that has any kind of link to Xinjiang. And obviously there are a couple of, you know, withhold release orders that Customs has out now on things like apparel, or, you know, cotton and tomatoes and a few other things, polysilicon. But they're obviously looking at, you know, any product that potentially is coming out of that region. You know, I think in general, retailers are constantly looking at evaluating their supply chains. You know, this started well before this, obviously with the China trade war. Folks were looking at shifting supply chains, with the further focus on the Uyghur situation that, you know, had companies, again, reevaluating their supply chains, trying to make sure they don't have any connections. You know, at the outset, companies don't want to employ or partner with anybody that engages in forced labor. I mean, that is, you know, priority number one as part of their CSR efforts, is ensuring they have clean supply chains. But obviously the challenge is trying to get back to the areas where you don't have direct contractor control. So looking at your, you know, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, you know, all the way back through the supply chain. I think companies are trying to do their part now and looking at different track and trace technologies and have better controls over their supply chains, but it continues to be a challenge. You know, on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, obviously there's been a lot of discussion over the past couple of years with the enforcement that Customs has been doing with the WROs that are in place. Part of this is trying to get better information from Customs, the Department of Homeland Security, and the federal government as a whole as to how to address some of these issues and what do we need to do this. Better information. What are the challenges that we're seeing, and how can retailers help to address the challenges? I think the last thing folks want to do is just completely pull up and cut off there, because how does that help address forced labor? I think you want to try and correct any of these challenges that are out there. So trying to address some of these challenges that are there, looking to pilot and work with CBP on some of these track and trace technologies. I think there are a lot of companies doing a lot of good work, but we've got to make sure that whatever technologies are put in place actually do their job, and actually help address the situation. So a lot of companies are paying a lot of attention to this, trying to identify, dig deeper into their supply chains to get that better understanding of what's happening. But again, coming up with a lot of questions for CBP and the government as a whole as to how can we partner to address these situations. Because to be honest, to address the forced labor situation, it can't just be left upon the companies to enforce. I think we've got to work and have a whole of government approach to this. So again, looking forward to working with CBP on their enforcement strategy, and looking forward to the larger government strategy that's being put in place. I think USTR now has some work they're doing on a strategy, Department of Labor and others. We've got to make sure that we're all working together to address these challenges. I think it's a kind of a 3 or 4-legged stool when you look at how to address this. It's industry, it's the NGOs, and it's government, both our own, the U.S. government, as well as working with our allies as well. We all need to be part of a solution going forwards.
Great. And Penny, I did want to ask you as well what kind of changes you're seeing in terms of corporate social responsibility, companies pursuing environmental or social goals with their supply chains. What kind of changes are you seeing now?
Yes, thanks for that. I think that in general, going back, so building off this point on human rights, building off the points on transparency, what I think we're all seeing out there today is just a lot more focus by companies and by our customers, by governments, on what we would call ESG. That's environment, social, and governance. And so it's something that I think is really it's really growing in importance, and it's something that a lot of us are trying to really pivot quickly on, because the demands have grown kind of exponentially in a very short amount of time. First off, I want to go back to something John talked about though with ESG, and that's the role of the consumer. So what we're seeing is consumers who want a lot more socially responsible, environmentally friendly goods, but they're sometimes making contradictory decisions with regards to when they select and when they take products. And so one of the things that I think we really need to do is focus on how do we help educate the consumer on these issues and help them make the best choices based on what's important to them. What we're seeing in the transportation sector in particular is, again, going back to our theme of today, efficiency. The first and the most important thing you can do in supply chains is make them efficient. For every mile you're not flying, piloting a boat in, etc., you're saving fuel. So finding and driving efficiency in supply chains remains the absolute critical first step. And then above and beyond that, we're really looking at how can we employ more environmentally sustainable technologies in the future of transportation. And that's got a slightly longer, medium, and long-term trajectory. But that's become something that's very important. And again, we're hearing about it often from customers, also from our employees and from our investors. So this is, I think, an area that's going to continue to be important for anybody involved in trade. We're going to see more activity on climate change and trade agreements. So I think the interest in this issue is just rising exponentially, and it's something we're all going to have to think about moving forward as we continue to build supply chains and as we continue to look at trade.
Yeah, the last few months have been actually the first time that I had to learn about carbon pricing and incorporate that into my trade reporting. So that's been kind of interesting to see the administration merge some of these environmental goals with trade goals, and companies as well, right? Make that change. Phil, I just want to ask you, we've seen a lot of conversation in Washington recently about the need to move supply chains out of China for a lot of different reasons, whether human rights issues in Xinjiang, national security considerations, environmental impact. But how much of that are we actually seeing? How much reshoring are we actually seeing right now?
Well, there's different things. There's a great question. There's moving out of China, and then there's sort of reshoring, which is the idea that we're going to have it either in the US or nearshoring right close. I think it's something where there's probably more political enthusiasm than we're seeing an actual movement. I think this is a time when, for all the reasons we've discussed throughout this session, businesses are wide open to looking at new possibilities. That, if you say, here's a new proposition, here's how you can do something in Central America, or here's how you can do something in Mexico, absolutely open to looking at that. The problem is that, what China had done was establish a system of servicing supply chains, which was quite and remains quite efficient. And it's also, once you remember, the second largest economy in the world. So, that's not easy to replace. And even within Asia, we saw a move there to, how about Vietnam? And there was a big push to get into Vietnam that was quite successful. I think Vietnam did well, but you quickly strain capacity. Vietnam is not as large as China is, and you can't automatically do this. And they don't have the infrastructure that China has developed over decades. It's changing, but you're not there yet. The other thing to keep in mind is there's a temptation, I think, to just sort of look at a map and say, Latin America is a lot closer. That must be easier. It's kind of the difference between, big interstate highways and back roads. That what you have going across the Pacific is the big interstate highway. Now, it may have been congested of late. It has been, but you don't have those highways as well established to other parts of the world. So there's people looking at it, they're thinking about that. The last thing I'll mention is there's really a fairly long checklist of things that businesses can and do consider for what is a good supplier. And it was mentioned earlier, the very good point about, can you travel? Can you check out what are the practices of the place? How reliable is the supplier? Will you have port interruptions? Will there be strikes? Will there be, other things that will block you from moving your product out? Will you be able to bring in the supplies that you need for the factories to do things? And so I think that's what you're getting businesses exploring. And so the answers aren't always that obvious. It's not simply a matter of how close or, at first blush, what is the cost? So that's a long-winded version. The short version is there's some, but I don't think it's anywhere near as much as it's appeared in the political rhetoric.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And if I could just jump in there, just to tie into, Phil made a great point that all, that checklist, it takes time to go through that and fully evaluate any new vendor you're going to bring on board. Take months, if not years, to fully evaluate that, to make sure that, they meet the quantity, quality that you need for your products. The capacity issue that Phil raised, as far as nobody can replace the capacity that's in China. It's extremely difficult to do that. But the fact that during the pandemic, you couldn't go out and travel and go and physically verify makes it that much more difficult to switch your vendors. You can only do so much over Zoom and MS Teams, but so it's a challenge. But companies continue to look and evaluate. And, besides just the general, can they make what I want? Do they meet the quality that I want? Do they meet all the different health and safety requirements based upon US government rules? But do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the skilled workforce? Do they have the ports? Do they have the vessel rotations that need to happen? These are all considerations that go into this. And unfortunately, it takes time to build that out.
Great. And Maria, what about the agricultural supply chains? What changes do you think need to be made to better manage agricultural supply chains in the future? What would the ag community like to see?
I'd say that there's two things that come to top of mind. And one, it's for the Senate to introduce and pass the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. That's going to do a lot. There are a lot of provisions in the House version that will do a lot to alleviate the congestion that we're seeing at the ports and to speed up the ability to turn around cargo. And so we would love to see the Senate to take up that companion bill. And two, I'd be remiss without having to mention that we need a better visa pipeline. So unemployment in rural America is a couple of percentage points lower than the national average. And in some of these areas, there's a large participation rate. So there's already those workers that are actively participating in the workforce. And we can talk about building new packing plants or building new farms, but moving ships through faster, but it all comes down to labor availability on farm, at the packing plant, at the tracking facility, or the truckers, and at the port. So it's certainly, that's one of the things that we certainly need to have a holistic approach.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all of you. It's been very interesting. Really delighted to be here.